Let me tell you about an email I got a month ago. It wasn't the kind of story you forget, not the kind you read late at night and just brush off. No, this one stayed with me. The subject line read, "The house next door." Here's what the sender wrote. "My name's Mark, and I don't even know where to begin. I've been carrying this story around for years, telling myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But it was. I see that now. This happened in 2012, in a little suburb just outside Indianapolis. I just moved into my first house, a cozy little fixer-upper on a quiet street. My neighbors were polite but distant, except for the guy who lived directly next door. His name was Danny, and from the moment I met him, I didn't like him. He had this way of looking at you, like he already knew something about you that you didn't. He'd stand in his yard, shirtless, smoking these foul-smelling cigars, always watching. Sometimes he'd wave, but he never smiled. I brushed it off. People are weird, right? Besides, I was busy with work and trying to fix up the house. I didn't have time to think about the creepy guy next door. But then, little things started happening. The first was the dog. It wasn't mine, I didn't have a dog, but it showed up one night, scratching at my back door. A skinny little thing, probably a stray. I gave it some scraps and left it alone, figuring it would wander off. The next morning, I found it dead on my porch. Its neck had been snapped. I was horrified, but I told myself it wasn't Danny. It could have been another animal, or maybe the poor thing was just sick. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew. The next few weeks were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of Danny out of the corner of my eye, standing in his yard, staring at my house. One night, I came home late from work and found him sitting on my front steps. "Lost something?" he said, holding up my mailbox key. I hadn't even noticed it was missing. "Thanks," I said, taking it from him. My hand was shaking. He just stood there, watching me unlock my door. I didn't sleep that night. The breaking point came 2 months later. It was a Friday night, and I was painting the spare bedroom when I heard a noise. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the wall. I froze, my brush hovering mid-air. The noise stopped. Then it started again, louder this time. I pressed my ear to the wall. That's when I heard it whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from inside the wall. My stomach turned. I ran outside, straight to Danny's house, ready to confront him. His lights were off, and his car wasn't in the driveway. He wasn't home. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I called a contractor to check the wall. He came over, tapped around, and finally cut a small hole to take a look. And that's when he found it. A camera. It was old, wired through the wall and pointing straight into my bedroom. There were more too, one in the bathroom, one in the kitchen. The guy said the setup looked like it had been there for years. I called the cops, and they took a statement, but there wasn't much they could do. By the time they got a warrant to search Danny's house, he was gone. The place was empty, like he'd never even lived there. I moved out a week later. I couldn't stay, not after that. But sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself checking the walls. And I still wonder, how many hours of my life did he watch? What did he see? And where is he now? That's Mark's story. It's the kind of thing that makes you realize the scariest monsters aren't hiding under your bed. They're living next door. They say you never really know your neighbors. You wave, you smile, you exchange polite words about the weather. But what if, behind closed doors, the people you think you know are hiding something unspeakable? This next story was sent in by Jessica, who learned the hard way that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones you should fear the most. Let's call this one The Shed. It started with a smell. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where lawns are manicured and every house has a picket fence. The kind of place where nothing ever happens. At least, that's what I thought. My next-door neighbors, the Bennetts, were your typical family. Tom, the husband, worked construction. Lisa, the wife, was a stay-at-home mom. They had 2 kids who were always running around the yard, laughing and screaming. We weren't close, but we were friendly enough. Lisa would drop off cookies during the holidays, and Tom helped me fix my mailbox once after a storm. Then, one summer evening, I noticed it, the smell. It was faint at first, like something had died nearby. I figured it was a raccoon or a stray cat that got hit by a car and dragged itself into the bushes to die. Gross, but not unheard of. But the smell didn't go away. Over the next few days, it got worse. By the end of the week, it was unbearable. I couldn't sit on my porch without gagging. I mentioned it to Lisa one morning when I saw her in her garden. She gave me a tight smile and said, "Tom's been working on a project in the shed. Sometimes he leaves the door open and critters get in." That seemed off. Their shed was more of a glorified storage unit, packed with tools and junk. What kind of project could cause a stench like that? Later that night, I decided to take a walk. I wasn't trying to snoop, honestly. I wasn't, but as I passed by their yard, I saw Tom outside. He was dragging something across the lawn, something wrapped in a tarp. I froze. It was dark, and he didn't see me. He hauled the bundle toward the shed, grunting with the effort. When he reached the door, he glanced around, almost like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. That's when I made my mistake. I stepped back, and a branch snapped under my foot. Tom's head whipped around. For a second, our eyes met, and I swear I've never seen a look like that before. It was pure, cold calculation. I mumbled something about taking an evening walk and hurried back to my house. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was trash or old furniture he was getting rid of. But the smell didn't go away. A few nights later, I woke up around a.m. to a loud banging sound. It was coming from their yard. I peeked out my bedroom window and saw Tom in the shed again. He was hammering something hard. Sparks flew as he worked, and every so often, he'd stop to look over his shoulder like he was expecting someone. The next morning, I called animal control, figuring they could check out the smell without it seeming suspicious. When they showed up, Lisa met them at the gate, all smiles and apologies. "We took care of it," she said. "Tom found the source. It was a dead possum. He's already cleaned it up." That was a lie. The smell didn't go away. I tried to let it go, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. So one night, when I saw the Bennett's car pull out of the driveway, I decided to check for myself. I hopped the fence and crept toward the shed. The smell hit me like a punch in the face, so strong it made my eyes water. The door was locked, but I found a crowbar in their yard and pried it open. Inside, it was worse. There were tarps everywhere, stained with something dark and sticky. Tools hung on the wall, saws, hammers, knives, most of them crusted with dried blood. In the corner, there was a large freezer. My stomach churned as I approached it. The lid was heavy, but I managed to lift it. Inside were plastic bags, each one tightly sealed. I didn't have to open them to know what was inside. I stumbled out of the shed, my head spinning. I ran back to my house and called the police. They came quickly, and when they searched the shed, they found more than I did. Bones, some burned, some intact. A notebook with names and dates. And bodies. It turns out Tom wasn't working late at construction sites. He was picking up hitchhikers and drifters. Lisa knew, of course. She helped him. Those cookies she baked, she delivered them with the same hands that helped her husband clean up after his projects. The Bennetts were arrested, and the shed was torn down, but I'll never forget the smell. Even now, years later, when I walk past their empty lot, I swear I can still smell it. Jessica's story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it's the people next door, the ones who wave, who smile, who bake cookies for the holidays. So, next time you think you know your neighbors, just remember, you might not know them at all. You ever have one of those neighbors that just doesn't sit right with you? The kind that doesn't do anything outright suspicious, but still makes your skin crawl. This next story comes from a guy named Evan, who emailed me with the subject line, "The Man in the Blue Hat." Here's what he wrote. This happened in 2015, back when I was living in a small town in Michigan. I'd just gone through a divorce, and honestly, I wasn't in a great place. I rented this tiny one-bedroom apartment in a complex on the edge of town, trying to figure out what my next move was. The first time I saw him, the man in the blue hat, was my second night there. I was out on my balcony, having a beer and scrolling through my phone, when I noticed him standing by the dumpster across the lot. He was wearing this faded blue baseball cap, and he wasn't doing anything. Just standing there. I figured he was another tenant, maybe taking out the trash or waiting for someone. But after 10 minutes, he was still there, staring straight at my building. I told myself it wasn't my problem. People are weird, right? But then it started happening every night. Same time, same spot, same blue hat. At first, I ignored it. I just closed the curtains and go back to whatever I was doing. But after a week, I couldn't stand it anymore. I leaned over the balcony and yelled, "Hey, you need something?" He didn't answer, didn't even flinch, just stood there staring. I went inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I asked my landlord about him. She gave me this puzzled look and said she didn't know who I was talking about. "No one's been hanging around the dumpsters," she said. That should have been the end of it, right? But it wasn't. A few nights later, I woke up around a.m. to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a text from an unknown number. The message said, "Nice place you got." I froze. I didn't respond, but I checked the locks on my doors and windows, my heart pounding. Everything was secure. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe someone from work messing with me. But then I got another text. "You should check your closet." I swear I felt my blood turn to ice. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a golf club, and crept toward the closet. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the handle. It was empty. I didn't sleep at all that night. The texts kept coming over the next few days. Stuff like, "I like your jacket," or "Blue really suits you." Things that made it clear whoever it was could see me. I called the cops, but without a name or proof, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to be careful and keep my phone on me. Real helpful, right? The last straw came about 2 weeks after the first text. I'd come home late from work, and as I unlocked my door, I felt that prickle on the back of my neck. I turned around, and there he was. The man in the blue hat was standing at the end of the hallway, just watching me. I bolted inside and locked the door, my heart racing. I didn't even turn the lights on. I just crouched by the peephole, trying to see if he was still there. But the hallway was empty. That night, I packed a bag and drove straight to a motel. The next morning, I called my landlord and broke my lease. I didn't care about the penalty, I just wanted out. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when I'm in a crowded place, I'll spot someone in a blue hat. And for a split second, my stomach drops. I'll never know who he was or what he wanted, but I don't think he was just watching. I think he was waiting. That's Evan's story. And the worst part, he never got answers. Maybe he moved on, but what if the man in the blue hat just found someone else? Have you ever had one of those gut feelings? The kind that gnaws at you, like a little voice in the back of your head screaming, "Something's wrong, get out." This next story came from a woman named Sarah, and she told me that if she'd listened to her gut, she might have avoided the most terrifying night of her life. This happened when I was 23. I just graduated college and moved to Chicago for my first real job. Money was tight, so I ended up renting a studio apartment in an older building on the north side of the city. The kind of place where the floors creak no matter how quietly you walk, and you can hear your neighbors arguing through the walls. At first, it wasn't so bad. I was just excited to be on my own. The landlord was this older guy named Mr. Baker. He lived on site in the basement apartment, and he seemed nice enough. Maybe a little too nice. Every time I ran into him in the hallway or the laundry room, he'd linger, ask me questions like, "How do you like the place?" or "Making friends in the city yet?" At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but after a while, it started to feel weird. One day, he knocked on my door out of nowhere, holding a toolbox. He said he needed to check the pipes under my sink. I didn't think much of it at the time, so I let him in. But when he was done, he didn't leave right away. He stood there in the middle of my tiny apartment, looking around like he was taking inventory. Then he said something that still gives me chills. "It's nice and cozy in here. I bet you feel real safe." I laughed it off, but that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he'd said it, like it wasn't a compliment, but a warning. Things got worse after that. I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. My kitchen cabinets would be slightly open when I knew I'd closed them. A glass that I'd left on the counter would be in the sink. I even found my bedroom window unlocked one morning, even though I always kept it latched. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Living alone for the first time can mess with your head, right? But then, about a month after I moved in, I came home late from work to find my front door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it that morning. I stood there in the hallway, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself I'd just forgotten. I pushed the door open slowly and called out, "Hello?" No answer. I stepped inside, every nerve in my body on edge. Nothing looked out of place, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like someone had just been there. That night, I didn't sleep. The next day, I asked one of my neighbors if they'd ever had issues with Mr. Baker. She gave me this tight smile and said, "He's harmless. Just keep your boundaries." That evening, I installed a chain lock on my door. It didn't make me feel much safer, but it was better than nothing. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was a Friday, and I'd stayed in to watch a movie. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I was brushing my teeth when I heard a faint click coming from my front door. I froze. Slowly, I crept into the living room and peeked through the peephole. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Someone was crouched by my door, fiddling with the lock. I felt my stomach drop. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and called 911. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the words out. The operator told me to stay on the line, but before the cops got there, whoever it was ran off. When the police arrived, they couldn't find any sign of forced entry, but they did find scratches around the lock, like someone had been trying to pick it. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't even give Mr. Baker notice. I just left the keys on the counter and got the hell out of there. Here's the thing though, when I told my new landlord about what happened, he asked if I'd reported it to the building's management. When I said the landlord was the one I suspected, he went pale. Turns out, Mr. Baker wasn't even supposed to be living there. The building had been sold 6 months earlier, and the new owners hadn't hired him to stay on. He was squatting in the basement, pretending to still run the place. To this day, I don't know what his plan was, but I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out, and that's Sarah's story. It's not always shadows in the woods or bumps in the night. It's the people you think you can trust, the ones hiding in plain sight, that you really need to watch out for. What if the scariest person you ever met wasn't a stranger, but someone you thought you knew? Someone who could smile at you in the morning and terrify you by night. This next story is from a guy named Matt, who learned that monsters don't always hide in the dark. They can live right across the hall. This happened about 10 years ago when I was living in a small apartment building in Milwaukee. The place was nothing fancy, just 6 units, 2 on each floor, with a shared laundry room in the basement. Most of the tenants were quiet, kept to themselves, but there was one guy who stood out. His name was Carl. He lived in the unit across from mine. Early 50s, bald, glasses, always wearing plaid button-ups. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was something off about him. He had this habit of staring just a little too long. Like, if you passed him in the hall, he'd stop and watch you until you were out of sight. And he was always home. I worked from home back then, so I'd hear him moving around at all hours, heavy footsteps pacing back and forth, muffled conversations even though no one ever visited him. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone's got their quirks, right? But then, things started happening. One night, I came home late from grabbing dinner with friends. As I was unlocking my door, I noticed something weird. My doormat was gone. Just gone. I glanced over at Carl's door, and there it was, sitting right in front of his apartment. I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, I pointed at the mat and said, "Hey, I think you've got my doormat." He just stared at me for a second, then smiled this weird, toothy grin and said, "Oh, is it? I thought it was mine. You can have it back." He picked it up, handed it to me, and shut the door without another word. It was such a small, stupid thing, but it left me rattled. From that point on, I started noticing other oddities. Little scratches around my lock that hadn't been there before. My trash bags would go missing from the hallway before I could take them down to the bins. Uma, noit, acordai, comum leave barulho di betida. Estava vindo da parede que compartilhamos. Es toque, toque, toque. Ubati na parede e gritei. Per com isso. Sio ponto di ruptura. Veo cerca. Diem ms depois era uma noite de sexta-feira. U pedi comida para viajum. Quando fui at a porta para peglo. Notei algo sendo de beco. Do mu capacho dao di papel, de brado no era uma nota. Era fo a photo foi tirada pela janela da minha sala. Eu podia me vir sentado no sofá, assistindo TV, totalmente desajeitado senti como se mu estmago talvez que do no cho. Minhas mostremium, quando volte, per dentro, e tranque a porta. Uno conseguia per di pensar quo perdo algo tinha estado, como elas estavam sendo observados no dia seguinte. Fui direto ao gerente do pardio. Mostrei a ele a foto e contai tudo o que estava acontecendo. Ele levou a rio, diz que iria olhar para mim, mas antes que ele pudesse. Carl desaparecer, cheguei casa do trabalho 2 dias depois e vai ao cara da magnetino carregando cases do apartamento de Carl. Perguntei a ele o que estava acontecendo. Ele disse que Carl havia se mudado sem aviso parvio. Acabei de fazer as malas e serão odd, they were all of me. Mad's story is a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the noises in the dark or the creaks in the floorboards. Sometimes it's the person who lives just a few feet away, the one who's been watching you the whole time. Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to realize they were hiding a side of themselves you could never have imagined? Our next story comes from Sarah, who learned that even the people closest to us can harbor terrifying secrets. She called this story "The Night My Husband Wasn't Himself." I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It still feels surreal, like it didn't happen to me but to someone else. But it did. It was the summer of 2016, and my husband, Jake, and I had been married for 7 years. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in Colorado, the kind of place where you leave your doors unlocked and everyone waves at each other. Jake was dependable, predictable. He worked as a contractor, loved fishing, and always came home at 5:30 sharp. I never doubted him, never suspected anything. That night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Jake had told me he'd be home late. He had a meeting with a client about a big renovation project. It wasn't unusual. Around 9:15, I heard the front door open. I called out, "Hey, you're late. Did you eat already?" No answer. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the living room. Jake was standing there, but something about him was wrong. His shoulders were tense and his face was blank. He was holding something in his hand, a crowbar. I laughed nervously and said, "What's with the crowbar? Did something happen at work?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his grip on the crowbar tightening. My stomach sank. This wasn't my husband, not the man I knew. "Jake?" I asked, my voice shaking. He finally spoke, but his voice was cold, flat. "Sit down." I froze. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Was he hurt? Had he been drinking? When I didn't move, he raised the crowbar slightly and repeated. I said, "Sit down." I backed up and sat on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling. He started pacing, the crowbar swinging loosely in his hand. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. "Do you know how easy it would be to disappear?" I didn't respond. I didn't even breathe. He kept going, talking in this detached, almost casual tone. People go missing every day. They walk out the door and no one ever sees them again. Sometimes it's strangers. Sometimes it's someone they know. I was trying to piece it together, to figure out what the hell was going on. This couldn't be Jake. He wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel. But the man standing in front of me wasn't my husband. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. He blinked a few times, like he was waking up from a dream, and dropped the crowbar. "Sarah," he said, his voice back to normal. "What's wrong?" I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He looked down at the crowbar, then back at me confused. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I didn't sleep that night. Jake went to bed like nothing had happened, but I stayed up, sitting on the couch, replaying everything in my head. The next morning, I told him about what happened. He laughed. He actually laughed like I'd made it up. He said he didn't remember a thing, that I must have been dreaming. But I know what I saw. And here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. A week later, Jake went on a fishing trip with a friend. That friend never came back. Sarah's story is a chilling reminder that we can never truly know what's going on inside someone's mind. Sometimes, the real horror isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, it's the person sleeping right beside you. Imagine being trapped in a situation where every step you take might be your last, where the wrong move isn't just a mistake, it's a death sentence. Our next story comes from Alex, who found out just how far someone will go to keep their secrets buried. This is called The Wrong House. I've always loved jogging. It clears my mind, especially when life feels overwhelming. Back in 2018, I was living in a small town in Maine, working a job that barely paid the bills. Jogging was my escape. One Saturday, I decided to explore a new route. There was a wooded area about 2 miles from my apartment that I'd always avoided, mostly because the locals would say things like, "Don't go there. The paths aren't safe," but that day, I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The trail started off fine, quiet, peaceful. Just me and the sound of my sneakers hitting the dirt. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. There were no animals. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was silent, like the kind of silence that presses against your ears. And then I saw it. A house. It was old, falling apart, with ivy creeping up the sides and windows so dirty they looked like they'd been painted over. Something about it felt wrong. But curiosity got the better of me, and I thought, I'll just take a quick look. The front door was ajar. I told myself it was abandoned, it had to be, right? And pushed it open. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was this sharp, sour stink, like rotten meat left in the sun. I covered my nose and stepped inside. The living room was a mess. Furniture overturned, broken glass on the floor, and weird symbols scratched into the walls. At that point, every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was worse. There were cans of food stacked on the counters, some opened and spilling over with mold. But the thing that stopped me in my tracks was the freezer. It was an old chest freezer, the kind you'd see in a basement or garage. It was duct taped shut, and the tape looked fresh. I should have left. I know that now, but I didn't. I leaned in, about to touch the tape, when I heard it. Footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from upstairs. My blood went cold. I froze, my mind racing. Who the hell would be in a place like this? The footsteps got louder, and then I heard a voice, a low, angry mutter. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough. Whoever it was, they weren't happy. I turned and bolted for the door, but just as I reached it, it slammed shut. My heart was pounding as I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I heard the voice again, this time closer. "What are you doing in my house?" I spun around and saw him, a man in his 50s, maybe older, with wild hair and eyes that didn't look right. He was holding a shotgun, the barrel pointed straight at me. "I am sorry," I stammered. "I thought this place was abandoned." He didn't lower the gun. Instead, he grinned, showing teeth that were yellow and broken. "Abandoned? You think you can just walk in here?" I started backing up, my hands in the air. I'm leaving, okay? I didn't touch anything, but he shook his head. You saw the freezer, didn't you? I didn't know what to say. My stomach churned as I realized I wasn't getting out of this without talking my way out. I didn't open it. I said quickly, I swear, I didn't see anything. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he said, get upstairs. I hesitated, and he cocked the shotgun. I said, get upstairs. I don't know how I managed to move, but I did. He followed me, keeping the gun trained on my back. At the top of the stairs, he directed me into a room. It was empty except for a chair and a long chain bolted to the floor. My heart sank as I realized what it was for. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, my mind racing for a way out. You made a mistake coming here, he said. People don't just walk into someone else's house. I don't know where I found the courage, but I blurted out, if you let me go, I won't tell anyone. I'll pretend this never happened. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound. You think I haven't heard that before? And then, in a move I didn't plan, I lunged for the shotgun. I don't remember much after that. There was a struggle, a deafening blast, and then I was running. I don't even know how I made it out, but I did. I ran until I reached the main road and flagged down a car. When the police went back to the house, they found it empty. The man was gone, but the freezer, it wasn't empty. There were 3 bodies inside. Alex's story is a reminder of the dangers of curiosity and the horrifying things people can hide in plain sight. Sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones we imagine. They're the ones living among us, guarding their secrets at all costs. I got this email a few weeks ago. The subject line read, "You always hear about the ones who survive." Here's my story. It came from someone named Sarah. She didn't give a last name, just said she was a 35-year-old woman from Maine who had been trying to forget what happened to her in 2007. But one day, she stumbled across my channel and decided it was time to share. Here's what she wrote. I was 19 when it happened. My parents had kicked me out for reasons I won't bore you with, and I was living alone in this cheap, run-down studio apartment. The kind with thin walls and neighbors you only see when they're drunk or shouting at each other. I worked late shifts at a diner off Route 12, scraping together enough tips to make rent and occasionally treat myself to a pack of cigarettes or a gas station coffee. It was a Thursday night, or technically Friday morning. I'd gotten off work around a.m. and decided to walk home. It was only a mile, and I didn't have a car. Besides, it was summer, and the air felt warm for once. The streets were empty, except for the occasional car speeding past. I liked that hour. It was quiet, no one asking for anything, no sounds except my sneakers scuffing the pavement and the faint hum of crickets. But halfway home, I started getting this feeling. You know, like someone's watching you? I told myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard its footsteps. Faint at first, but definitely there, following me. I didn't look back. My brain was already spinning. Maybe it was just someone walking their dog, or maybe another diner employee heading home. But the footsteps didn't stop, and they didn't get closer either. They just stayed at the same steady pace. I turned onto a side street to see if they'd keep following. They did. My stomach sank. That's when I knew. I walked faster, trying to keep calm, but my mind was racing. Should I call someone? Scream? There was no one around, and my phone was a cheap flip phone with a dead battery. I spotted a gas station up ahead, one of those 24-hour ones, and I made a beeline for it. When I reached the bright lights of the parking lot, I glanced back, and that's when I saw him. He was maybe 40, wearing a dark hoodie, and standing just outside the shadows of the street lamp. He wasn't moving anymore, just watching me. I ran into the gas station, my heart pounding. The guy behind the counter barely looked up as I stumbled in, gasping for air. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. "There's a man, he's following me." The clerk looked bored. He waved a hand toward the coffee machine. "You want something to drink?" "Chill out." I turned 2 outside, but the man was gone. Just gone. I felt stupid, like maybe I'd imagined it, but I still didn't want to leave. I lingered there for almost an hour, pretending to browse the snack aisle until the clerk finally told me to buy something or leave. The walk home felt longer than usual, and I kept looking over my shoulder. But no one was there. By the time I got to my apartment, I was exhausted. I locked the door, double-checked it, and pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. That should have been the end of it. But when I woke up, something felt wrong. The air was too still. I looked at my door. The chair was moved. Before I could process that, I saw the note. A piece of paper on my kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. It said, "You're fun to watch." I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed. Maybe I called the cops. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I moved out the next day, left most of my stuff behind, and never went back. I never saw him again. But sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll feel it, that same prickle on the back of my neck. Like someone's there watching. I keep my windows locked, my curtains drawn. And I never, ever walk home at night anymore. That's Sarah's story. It's not ghosts or demons, just a person. A person with the worst kind of intentions. And that's what makes it scarier, right? Monsters aren't real, but people like him, they're everywhere. Stay safe out there.